So after breaking down both poll numbers and fundraising numbers, let's talk about the timeline ahead for these candidates. It's mid-October, over a year until the general election, and still over 6 months out from the primary. If you're watching this show, chances are you'll be spending each of those months ahead paying pretty close attention. But for many voters, that's not the case. How much of a gamble can these candidates take that at this point in the race to turn support in their favor? The 2026 primary election is on May 19th, so we still get a lot of time to really figure this out. I was speaking with Professor Stephen Voss earlier this week talking about the dilemma when it comes to spending money in a campaign very early on versus, spending a lot later whenever voters are really tuned in. We were talking about the fundraising numbers just this last block. We've seen both Barr and Morris spend a lot on TV lately. Is now the right time to be doing it?
I think you have two different kind of main blocks of voters. You have early deciders and late deciders. There's certainly a group in the middle, but you can do pretty well just by focusing on those two groups, the early and late deciders. So I think clearly they're working on kind of the early deciders now. I said earlier, the one thing you can't get more of in politics is time. And, Andy Barr has to introduce himself and get his name ID up to the same level as Daniel Cameron, who has basically universal name ID outside of the 6th District, whereas Barr's very low in those areas. So, I think that's why you see Congressman Barr spending money, especially outside of the 6th District, is to bring his name ID up, because then once the you kind of build a cushion. Like I said earlier, when you go negative, it brings you down a little bit too. So you've got to build that cushion to where when you do have to attack and you do have to kind of be a little bit more sharp and barbed, that you have your own positive name ID up to a point to where you can sustain that and kind of maintain and be able to overcome the little bit of negative blowback that you get by going negative. So I think that they're laying that groundwork now, and then there'll be a little bit of a gap, and then they'll have the late deciders that you'll be talking about the last 2-3 weeks of the campaign.
Morgan, what do you think the smart strategy is? Do you think it maybe differs between some of these candidates?
I think on both sides of the aisle with packed primaries, it's going to be a similar sort of timeline for everybody. And to Trey's point, you really want to lock in your hardcore voters that are going to be your ride or dies that you can turn into volunteers. You want to lock those folks in early. So if you're someone like Andy Barr or a lot of the Democratic candidates, you need to introduce yourself to voters. And of course, you can do that in person. You should always focus on the largest pockets of voters across the state. But TV, radio, digital ads, those are other smart strategies. And so I think you'll see right after the first of the year a lot more activity from both sides of the aisle on those. And then, they can work up into more aggressive campaigning ad strategies closer to the campaign. But they should all be focused on getting out to the most populated areas of voters where they know they're going to have high turnout, and lock in their voters now to hopefully shore up kind of their volunteer bench moving forward.
And look, as campaign consultants, campaign managers, we've figured out over the last 15, 20 years that the ROI is not in convincing swing or undecided voters. The ROI is in getting people who if they show up, they're going to vote for you out to the polls. So, if I was any of these campaigns, I'd be spending a lot of my time right now, especially doing data work, doing polling, doing voter profiling, all of the micro-targeting stuff you do in the background to try to create profiles on every voter that you can, so that when you get later, you have an idea, if I can get this person to the polls, they're probably going to vote for me. And then you really whittle down those universes so you can focus your spending in on those voters in particular to make sure that when you're spending money, you know that it's getting a voter who's probably going to vote for you to the polls, because the worst thing you can do is just kind of shotgun it and end up paying to turn out voters who vote against you.
Just a couple seconds left here. Any thoughts on how the political climate, whenever we get to the primary in May, or even whenever we get to the general in November, could affect not just the Senate race, but also some of these congressional races like we're watching, especially in the 6th?
As a Democrat, of course, I feel really good about where things are right now, and I think the momentum's on the side of Democrats. Of course, it's going to be a turnout game for the primary, and the same with the general. So we're going to be working really hard to make sure people are educated on the issues. They know what Republicans are doing to drive up their cost of living and strip them of things like health care and access to food. And we are going to work really hard to make sure we're reaching as many voters as we can so that they turn out and vote both in the primary and in the general.
All right.